So today we close up this series and we come to this idea of relationship ghouls and the ghouls of the vampires in our lives. Now, we're all probably pretty familiar with vampires. My shirt today talks about the most famous vampire of them all, Bram Stoker's Count Dracula, which we're all very aware of. But honestly, every generation, almost every culture has their version of this character that we call the vampire. And we read these stories of vampires, we find them in myths, we find them in books, we find vampires in stage productions and in movies. Now, all the characters change, right? In those, there are different characters. They might be called Dracula, they might be called something else. But these stories, they all kind of share a similar idea about this character. This character is a creature of the darkness. A creature that drains the life out of others to sustain itself, right? I mean, that's the picture of Dracula. That's the picture of the vampire. But while a vampire that I just described might be a fictional description of a character, we all encounter people like this in our lives, the vampires who walk among us. Now, the vampires that walk among us probably aren't cornered off to the darkness of night. They probably show up at your workplace. They probably show up maybe at your house. They might show up at your school. These vampires aren't people only of the night. They probably don't walk around in black robes and slicked back hair, though that might be helpful to be able to figure out who they are. It's probably even more unlikely that when you turn your back, they transform into a bat, right? But that's because these vampires that we all know, that we all live, that we all work with, are not supernatural creatures. But these vampires are people. These vampires are attitudes. These vampires are feelings that drain joy, hope, and light from our lives. And after they suck the joy and the life and the light out of our lives, they leave us physically, they leave us emotionally, and they leave us spiritually drained. Now, we don't have to actually look very far, and this is kind of funny. I've said that, you're not going to find, you can't go to like the index of the Bible and look up God, God through the Bible, would you tell me about ghosts? That's not really how the Bible works, right? You're not really going to go in, you're not going to be able to search up werewolves. You have to do that interpretive dance to sort of find how to deal with some of these ideas that we're talking through. The same is true. You're not going to be able to go in Scripture and to the index, the back of the book, and say, hey, I want to talk about vampires today. But what we do find is we find stories, we find scriptures that not only tell us about these vampires, but tell us how we can conquer, how we can defeat these sort of vampires in our lives. Now, one of the stories that we find is that we discover that Jesus dealt with vampires. Now, again, not turned into bat kind of vampires, okay? That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the vampires, the people, the feelings, and the attitudes. And Jesus experienced these kind of people in his life, and he experienced them all the time. One of the stories that we see of Jesus dealing with vampire-type people is a story where he healed a blind man. And it's amazing what happens in the story, because I don't know. Guys, if I saw somebody have a miraculous healing because of something that Jesus did, you would think that everybody would look and go, that is so awesome, and everybody would celebrate and get joy. Everybody would be joyful and clapping and be like, oh, let's keep going, Jesus. That's so awesome. Do it again. And instead, there was a group of people known as the Pharisees who did the exact opposite. Here's what's amazing. They see this healing take place. They hear about this healing that takes place. And rather than celebrate this apparent miracle, they spent the next several days doing this instead. They denied it, they criticized, and they even, listen to this, they even argued with the man who was healed. Can you think of anything more joy-sucking in life than somebody who has just been healed, that was blind, that can now stare at the criticizers of their life who look at them and say, are you sure about that? Let's check the tape. Let's talk about you. Maybe you're not telling, you know what? There's something wrong with you. You're not telling the truth. The guy would be like, what's wrong with you people? It even got so weird that these people even tracked down this man's parents and were like, help us figure out what's wrong with your son, because we're not buying this whole healing thing, right? So these are some serious vampires here, sucking the joy out of what should be a joyous celebration. Now, when these guys finally tracked down Jesus, it's interesting what he did. He turned things around on them. And what he did was he said, you know what you are? He used a word that we could talk about with vampires. He said, you're a bunch of thieves. And you seem bent on stealing the joy of others. The way, again, that we would put it is like a bunch of vampires. You come in and you're sucking the joy out of everything in this guy's life. But Jesus is talking to them and saying, no, but you suck the joy out of everything. It's like every moment that you guys walk into, you look around and go, all right, who's happy and how can we destroy it? And that's what Jesus says. That's why he doesn't play around with these guys. And he's like, you're a bunch of thieves. Here's what he actually wrote. Here's what he actually said in John 10:10. This is how it's described. It says that Jesus said that the thief, these Pharisees, these joy stealers, come only to steal, to kill, and to destroy. And I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. Now, there's an interpretive mistake that always happens with this passage, that for whatever reason, people read this passage out of context. And they talk about the thief, and the thief all of a sudden becomes sort of personalized into Satan or the devil. It's a huge mistake, because what happens there is, all of a sudden it begins to talk about sort of something else, some other thing, rather than what Jesus is talking about, which is actual people. Again, listen what he says. The thief, these vampires, these joy suckers, come only to steal and kill and destroy. And then Jesus says, but I have come that they may have life, that you may have life, and that you may have it to the full. Now, a couple more things about these Pharisees. They have a lot in common with vampires. Again, look what it says that they have. They don't just steal, they kill. See, the problem with vampires, and there's probably several problems with vampires, but let's just talk about the main problem with vampires. If sucking your blood isn't enough, right, which that probably does suck pretty bad, see what I did there? Is that eventually they take enough life from their victims to kill them. And that's what these Pharisees were doing. By sucking the joy out of everything, they eventually kill their victims. They kill their faith. They kill their life. And Jesus' issue with the Pharisees was that they were stealing God's purpose. And Jesus says this purpose is for us to live abundantly. This is one of those passages, and I just want to pause here for a second, because this is one of those places that I think it's so important for us to reset how we talk about faith. Earlier, I said a reset that I want us to begin to talk about is this idea that sometimes people talk about being a Christian like a noun. But here at Southeast, what we want to talk about is being Christian as a verb. That there is something so much better. Because a noun is, can I believe the right things? Can I fit in the right boxes? Can I be defined as a Christian because of these kind of things as a noun? Well, that's a moving thing that gets all kind of weird, right? Well, if I wear the right, cross or T-shirt, if I do this kind of thing, right? But being a Christian as a verb, that's like action. That's living as I talked to a friend last night about. That's living as a person of peace and patience and joy and goodness and gentleness and self-control. That's things that I can do. I can be Christian. I think that's such a better way to think through it. But what does that ultimately look like? What does it ultimately look like to be Christian? It means that all of a sudden we live a life of abundance. And I'm not talking about prosperity. I'm not talking about all of a sudden abundance in terms of like you're going to have that Porsche you always dreamed about, or you're going to have this big house you always wanted, your relationships are always going to. That's not the abundance he's talking about. The abundance he's talking about is an abundance of joy, an abundance of love, an abundance of grace, an abundance of mercy. And you know what? All that stuff, like just an aside, if you guys ever want to get me a great pastor appreciation gift, I've always wanted a yellow 1993 Porsche 911. I know it's not going to happen, so I'm just going to put it out there. But as I thought about it in my life, I've come to the point where I've realized at 45, I'm never going to have my Porsche 9. It's just not going to happen. But you know what? I don't need it. I don't need that stuff. Because what I've discovered is that life, true life, abundant life, fullness of life, is found in laughter and joy. That like moves beyond just like my life, but like explodes out into the world. Does that mean I'm always that person? No, right? That's the work we're trying to do. Being a person of patience, do you know me? But there's something that happens when you lean further in and become that kind of person. And goodness and gentleness and living out of that kind of abundance. See, here's the deal. When I find somebody who lives like that, all of a sudden what's really weird is it doesn't really matter what they believe anymore. But they sure do look a lot like Jesus. That's the kind of person that I want to be. So Jesus' issue is that, hey, you're stealing what people are supposed to be. Abundant life kind of people. So here's what I want to do with the rest of our time this morning. I want to expose these vampires for what they really are. I want us to learn this morning how we are going to identify these vampires. Again, not just the people in our lives, okay? So I don't want us to be staring across the room and being like, oh, that's the kind of vampire that person is. This is really looking inward as well, seeing the vampires that we are capable of being. Because there's not really just one kind of vampire. There's several different kind of vampires that we can be, and we all struggle with a different aspect of these sorts of vampires. Does that make sense? So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of walk through a castle this morning. So I want you to imagine, just for a second, can you imagine sort of a Count Dracula scary castle with me? If you need to close your eyes, that's fine. That's okay if you need to do that, if you're kind of a person who just needs to imagine that for a moment. My castle, I just want to tell you about my castle. My castle, you walk up a path, and there's all kinds of like thorns. They're probably purple. Mine are like purple thorns, and they're sort of going up the castle. You get to the gate kind of crashes down. You hear like the big brrr, right? Then you walk in the castle, it's creepy, the door opens. I don't know, I feel like there should probably be somebody there going, welcome to the castle. You're kind of like, oh, is this like we're playing Clue? What's happening here, right? And I walk in, and it's creepy, there's probably an organ playing, nobody's playing it, but it's playing, right? You know the sound of that, right? This is my castle. So you can imagine your castle. It can have Fruit Loops and rainbows if you want it to have. But whatever you need to have your castle be, as we explore these vampires, that's what I want you to do today. Now, we're also going to discover something else as we think about these castles. I want to not just identify them, but I want us to arm ourselves with some weapons that help us to defeat them. Now, here's what's fascinating. Did you know this is what's so fascinating about vampires? Did you know that in all of these vampire myths, that the most fascinating thing about these vampires is that the defense of vampires is layered in all kinds of spiritual language. So people throughout these myths, throughout history, would defeat vampires with things like crosses, and they would use holy water, and they would use like light that would come into a room. Now don't worry, this is not one of those days we're going to have some tables set up. We're not going to have a moment where we're going to create some different things. We're not going to have a vat of holy water later today that we're going to carry around with us. Because I think that our modern day vampires, it's probably not going to do a lot to walk around with a big crucifix, a bucket of holy water, or never going into a dark room. That's probably not the answer. You do you, right? But I think there's another way to address these things in our lives today. And the first part is, again, by identifying the kind of vampires. Like I said, our modern day vampires, they take on all kinds of forms. They disguise themselves in all kinds of ways. And sometimes, here's the really tricky part about them. It's that whole bat thing flying in. We don't even see them until it's too late. So let's walk slowly. Let's walk cautiously this morning through our haunted castle and learn from some passages how we can defeat the vampires that we learn along the way. Now, my vampires that I'm going to show are cute because I think they should be cute to help us not get too scared. But we begin with our first vampire. His name is Count Complainer. Count Complainer is our very first vampire. Now, this first vampire is probably the most common vampire of them all. Now, I'll be on my notes a little bit today because my notes are sort of titled Book of Vampires and How to Defeat Them. So I want to make sure that we're very clear on what we're discussing this morning. Now, Count Complainer is easy to find because for Count Complainer, there's always a dark cloud above his head that follows him wherever he goes. Does anybody know any Count Complainers in life? This is the person who never has anything positive to say ever, no matter the situation. Count Complainer is the person only focused on problems, obstacles, and worst case scenarios. Now, again, before you start looking around, quit it. Stop looking around. I'll caution you, if this isn't you, another vampire that we encounter in a little bit is probably you. So as we talk about the defense, please realize your time is coming. Now, one of the churches that the Apostle Paul started was in the city of Philippi. And the letter that he wrote to them is made up of fragments from several different letters that he wrote to this one church. So when we look at our scriptures and we look at the book of Philippians, we're really reading what amounts to a whole bunch of correspondence that he wrote to them. Paul was in prison during the writing of at least most of this letter. So I want you to think about Paul sitting in prison, writing to these people that he's trying to tell about how to live like Jesus. And I think what's amazing about what Paul does here is that he begins to offer some advice to them. And as I think about this is probably advice that he himself needed to hear. So listen to the words that he wrote them as he thinks about some of these Count Complainers in our lives. Philippians 4:8, he says this, "Brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things." See, Count Complainer just looks and says, ugh, look at all these problems. But there's another kind of way to approach it. What's noble? What's right? Lovely. What's excellent? You know what's praiseworthy? A bunch of knuckleheads getting together, wearing Halloween costumes, and having a great time at church. That is praiseworthy. Now, Paul doesn't mean here that we don't see problems in the world, okay? Remember, he was in prison when he wrote this. So I want to make sure this is clear. This is not that all of a sudden we go, oh, well, stop bringing up all the problems. I don't want to hear all that. So we don't ignore the problems of our world. That would be something we should not do, right? So I think what he wants us to do is instead this. I think he wants us to get to a place where we know that there are problems, but they aren't the only things we see. Does that make sense? I know that there are problems in the world. I know there are problems in my life, but it's not the only thing I see. And with this better perspective, the problems we see are the places that we have an opportunity to share grace and mercy and the love of God with those around us in a similar predicament. Count Complainer is always complaining because their car never runs and everything's always broken. So say, you know what? Man, life is fine. I got some stuff I got to figure out, but it's all going to work out. I got trust. I got hope. Man, I got friends. Person looks at you and says, I guess that'll work out after all. Sort of the point of the song, I got friends in low places, man. I need my friends in my low places because they'll be low with me. So Count Complainer can't survive in an environment like that. Count Complainer can't survive in an environment where you look at your problems and go, you know what? It's all going to be okay. I'm going to figure it out. And the places that I see that are so tough and so broken in our world, I'm going to gather people with me, and we're going to challenge, and we're going to fight those problems head on with grace and goodness and hope. And Count Complainer says, I can't be a part of that. Well, once we defeat Count Complainer, we end up running into another one of his companions, though, that tries to set us off our course, and the closely related Count Conniver. Now, Count Conniver doesn't drain you with words of negativity like our previous enemy. Instead, Count Conniver drains you by taking advantage of you or lying to you to get what they want. Stop looking around the room. They make you feel like, now listen to this, they make you feel like you're responsible for their happiness. Count Conniver takes advantage of your kindness, they take advantage of your time, they take advantage of your resources. And when you inevitably run out and you fail to provide them with what they want, they instead begin to fill your life with guilt and shame. Does anybody know some Count Connivers? Oftentimes, the way that they fill you with guilt and shame is by twisting your words into promises that you never made. Promises that they actually even never planned to keep. Now, one time, what's crazy about this is one time Jesus actually addressed this reality because Jesus lived in a world full of humans too. So the idea that people were connivers and manipulators and taking advantage of other people, it was common in his time too. The ancient world, just like today, people had the tendency to make promises that they didn't intend to keep. So here's what they would do. Now, this is amazing. Because they didn't intend to keep the promises they were going to make, they would begin to swear on things rather than swearing on God. So if you're going to swear on God's name, I swear on God's name, they're like, I'm not going to keep this anyways. And that seems like even a worse idea than a pastor wearing a devil costume. Like, I probably should not swear on God's name. You know, there's a whole commandment about this, about swearing on God's name and not keeping the promises you plan to keep, using God's name inappropriately. So they began to swear on all sorts of other things to get away with it. So what they would do is they would begin to swear on different things. And all this did was lead people to lie to each other and manipulate each other even more to get what they wanted. So Jesus addresses this. Listen to what he says. He says again, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago. So he says, you people know this. You know this. You know that you're not supposed to break your promises. You know that you're not supposed to manipulate people. He says, it was said to the people long ago, do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows that you have made. But I tell you, do not swear an oath at all. Either by heaven, for that's God's throne. You know, somebody's like, I won't swear on God's name. I'll swear on heaven. That'll get me away with it. Or by the earth. Well, I swear by the good nature of the... No, that's not going to work either, he says. For it's his footstool. Don't swear by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And then he goes on, he gets away from spiritual language. He says, do not swear by your head, for you cannot make even one hair white or black. He says, here's all you need to do. All you need to do is simply say yes or no. And he says, anything else comes from the evil one. Anything else is evil and messed up and wrong. Just say yes or no. Now, in relationships where manipulation is present, it is so essential like this to stand firm. When you say yes to someone, when you say yes to Count Conniver, mean it. Yes, I will do that. When you say no, don't allow a person to use the guilt or shame to make you waver, right? Have we all done this, right? Here's the key to this one. You don't need to be controlled. I'm going to say this nice and loud for all of the connivers. And you don't need to control others. Can we say this together? Can we say this together? Say, I don't need to be controlled. Oh, see? How great that is, right? I don't need to be controlled. And how do I not be controlled? I look at somebody and I say, yes. I said yes. I don't want to be controlled. I said no. Oh, but I said no. You don't have to waver. You don't need to be controlled, and you don't need to control others. It's that place of honesty. Oh, yeah, we didn't say that. We already said I don't need to be controlled. You ready? I don't need to control others. I'm going to say that extra loud for myself real quick. I don't need to control others. Oh, see, that feels really good. That feels really good. I don't need to control others. So when we're tempted to be Count Conniver, know what? I don't need to control other people. It's in that place of honesty and integrity that Count Conniver loses his battle with us. So now, we have survived 2 of the vampires, and we found ourselves at the toughest to defeat, Count Covetous. This is the person or the attitude that cannot celebrate the blessings of others because they're too focused on what they don't have. This is the guy that when the Porsche 911 pulls up next to me on Meridian Street, I look over and I go, oh, you know what? It's probably a jerk. It's probably a real jerk. Inside, I'm really going, man, I really want that. I'm driving a 2001 Jeep Grand Cherokee with 205,000 miles. I bet that Porsche with that stick, oh, that manual, could you just imagine? See, that's Count Covetous, right? That's envy. I don't know what you envy, but you can't be happy for somebody else because you don't have it. Instead of being happy for others, Count Covetous responds to the success of others with jealousy, resentment, and even criticism as their envy sucks the joy out of moments that should be full of celebration. In the book of Proverbs, it's a book of wisdom in the Bible, we read about the creepy results of envy. Listen to what this says. A heart at peace gives life to the body, but envy rots to the bones. So the next time that you're feeling envious of somebody, the next time you feel like, I want what they have and I need it so bad, just imagine all of your bones just rotting to nothingness. That might help a little bit, right? But the heart at peace that says, I'm okay. I got what I need. I got joy and happiness, and I got life. I got good neighbors. I got everything. I'm set. I'm good. Even in the hard times, I've got what I need. I got friends in low places, right? I'm in a good place. We do that, something begins to change. One last thing, in a letter to the church in the city of Rome, the Apostle Paul built on this truth in addressing the envious. But as he does that, he also addressed those who might be envied. Listen to what he says. He says, rejoice with those who rejoice. Mourn with those who mourn. Truthfully, some of the best advice in all of Scripture. Do you know how much the world would change if we would just rejoice with those who rejoice and mourn with those who mourn? Can you imagine how much the world would change just with that? Well, Paul says what that looks like is this. He says, live in harmony with one another. Now, harmony is when 2 notes that aren't the same note sound awesome when they're together. Harmony is when Kurt is singing the melody and Lindsay is singing the harmony, and it comes together and the notes just sound so beautiful and so peaceful together. See, because I think that's what he's talking about here, that there's harmonious relationship when we meet each other in those places. We say, if you're mourning, I'm going to meet you there. And I'm going to meet the people who are joyful. I'm going to meet you there. And there's harmony and peace that happens in those moments. Then he goes on, how do we do this? Well, do not be proud. Be willing to associate with people of low position. And he goes on, do not be conceited. So for those who might be envied for what they have, quit shoving it in everybody's faces. Quit being so conceited about it. Because you know what? It might come back around the other way, and you may be in a different position. And for those who aren't feeling that, that you're like, oh man, I can't stand these people because they've got all this stuff. Just rejoice with those who are rejoicing. It's in the empathetic walk with others that Count Covetous is defeated. And it's his defeat that we find ourselves in the final room of the castle of our final lesson. I said before that the vampires of myth were defeated by spiritual objects. And the reality for us when we fight our relationship vampires actually isn't that far off from that. The joy, peace, and fullness our relationship vampires attempt to steal is exactly what Jesus offers. But that abundance, now hear me on this because I think this is so cool, that abundance is the key to their defeat. The more that we lean into the way of Jesus, the more that we lean into his love and his grace and his mercy, the more that we lean into the abundant life that he wants to give us, of living as people of love, as living as people of peace, as living as people of joy, the more that all of that comes out of our lives, the more that these relationship vampires can't even get close to us. Isn't that cool? So the very thing that they're trying to steal from us is the very thing that Jesus says by following him that he wants to give us. So here's what I want to invite us to do. I want to invite you to walk out of that creepy, scary castle of your mind. I want you to leave those relationship vampires behind. And I invite you to join me in walking this path that leads away from this castle and into this life that we find in Jesus. Life that we talked about before, of joy, of not being envious of people. Think about these. We're not being envious of people. We're not trying to manipulate people. We're not trying to complain about all of the problems that we see and not the good things that are in front of us. But instead, we live as people of love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and gentleness and self-control. Man, that's not easy. Which is why I look to Jesus. Because Jesus did it better than anybody who ever lived. And see, I want to live like that. Not just believe in that, but live like that. So that all these relationship vampires, all these ghouls that we've talked about, have no power over our lives anymore. And I think the world needs a group of people who live like that too. So let's pray. God, we are thankful that over the course of this series, we have the opportunity to look at these relationship ghouls that have haunted our lives for far too long. That though while we use funny language and we talk about these vampires and these werewolves and these ghosts in our lives, God, that we recognize that they are very real things that we struggle with. So God, I ask that you would continue to help us to walk the path of Jesus. Not just as individuals, but as a community of people, seeking to live out that love, seeking to live out that grace, seeking to live out that joy, being people, again, who mourn with people who are mourning, being joyful with people who are joyful. God, being people of grace and mercy and peace. God, there's something so powerful that happens in our own lives when we live like that, but what is amazing is that we see how the world is changed around us. And God, as we look around this world, it needs more love. And it needs more joy. And it needs more peace. Help us to be the kind of people bringing that into this world. It's in your name that we pray this morning. Amen.